She just wanted to say goodbye to her father, but the rich family decided otherwise. What happened afterward changed their lives forever. Subscribe. And write in the comments, where are you watching from? The sun had not yet risen when Maylene stood in the kitchen of the Carrington estate, tying her apron in silence. The grand chandelier above her head glimmered faintly in the half-light, casting fractured reflections across the marble countertops. She moved about with practiced grace, her hands automatically reaching for the French press, the kettle, the set of antique porcelain cups laid out the night before. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and starch, remnants of the daily scrubbing she performed long after everyone else had gone to bed. She did not need to look at the clock. Her body had long since memorized the rhythm of this place, its demands, its silences, its rules. 12 years. 12 years she had risen in the darkness to prepare breakfast for people who hardly knew her name, who certainly never used it. To them, she was the maid, the help, dear when they were feeling civil, girl when they were not. Maylene had once imagined that with time there might be warmth, perhaps a gentle nod, a sincere thank you. But now, in her 40s, with joints that ached every time she bent to polish the Carringtons' marble floors, she no longer expected such things. She had learned to fade, to exist without taking up space. By the time the coffee was brewed and the scones reheated, the sun had just begun to push a soft pink glow through the tall windows. The estate stood in its usual icy grandeur, 3 stories of stone and glass, imported from Europe, if the guest stories were to be believed. The walls were lined with oil paintings of pale-faced ancestors. The rugs were thick, muffling every sound, as though even footsteps had to whisper in this house. She moved like a shadow through the halls, adjusting pillows, straightening paintings, making the house perfect before the Carringtons emerged. Mrs. Carrington was the first to descend the staircase, her silk robe swaying as she glided into the dining room. She was a slender woman in her late 60s, always impeccably dressed, her platinum hair styled into a flawless coif that never seemed to move. Her lips were sharp, her smile tighter than the skin stretched across her cheeks. She acknowledged Maylene with a flick of her eyes before taking a seat. "Warm, not hot," she said, inspecting the coffee as if it might betray her. "Yes, ma'am," Maylene murmured, careful to pour just the right amount. She stepped back, blending into the background like a well-trained stagehand. The daughters came next, Belinda and Ashley. Both in their 20s, both molded from their mother's image. They wore designer loungewear and carried their phones like scepters. Their laughter filled the room like perfume, excessive and cloying. "Mom, did you see what Darla wore to the club last night?" "It was tragic," Belinda said, tapping at her phone. Ashley giggled. "It looked like something the maid would wear." Neither of them looked up. The joke was casual, thoughtless, tossed like crumbs to the floor. Maylene felt the sting but did not flinch. She had long since trained herself to absorb insults like those. She had a way of folding pain into her chores, ironing it out with the linens, sweeping it away with the crumbs. She stood by the wall, waiting in silence, as the women sipped coffee and discussed vacations and politics. The conversation floated above her like perfume, frivolous, unattainable. Occasionally, Mrs. Carrington would raise a hand, snapping her fingers without turning her head. "More jam," she said once. "Toast is too dark. The tablecloth has a wrinkle." Maylene moved swiftly each time, smoothing, correcting, replacing. No eye contact, no words beyond, "Yes, ma'am." That was the unspoken law of the Carrington estate. Once breakfast was cleared, she carried the dishes to the kitchen, where the chef would not arrive for another hour. She began the process of hand-washing the fine china, scrubbing with quiet precision, her thoughts drifting to the garden she never saw, the sky she barely remembered. The rest of the day unfolded in its usual rhythm, polishing silver, vacuuming the rugs, fluffing the down pillows in the guest bedrooms. There were no breaks, no pauses. Lunch had to be prepared for the daughters before their tennis lessons. The linens had to be aired, the pantry inventoried, the schedule of the week confirmed with the house manager. Every task was listed, timed, and expected to be completed without deviation. By evening, her legs ached. She carried a tray of cocktails into the parlor where Mr. Carrington now sat, his legs crossed, reading the financial section of the Times. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a voice that rarely rose above a practiced murmur. He nodded without looking up. "Put it there," he said. Maylene obeyed. Her arms trembled slightly under the weight of the silver tray, but she steadied herself. She had served him for more than a decade, and still he barely glanced at her. Dinner was a formal affair, even when there were no guests. The dining table stretched across the room like a runway, adorned with crystal and china. Maylene served each course in silence, careful not to let her footsteps echo, her presence be noticed. She moved between the courses, retrieving plates, refilling glasses, responding to gestures rather than words. At one point, Belinda turned to her sister and laughed. "I don't understand how anyone could want to do this for a living. It must be so depressing." Ashley shrugged. "Well, people like her don't really have lives, do they? They're just part of the furniture." They laughed again. Maylene continued clearing the plates. Her hands shook slightly, but her face betrayed nothing. She had learned to wear invisibility like a uniform. If she showed pain, they would dismiss it. If she showed strength, they would punish it. Later, as she retreated to her small room in the servants' wing, a narrow space with a cot, a nightstand, and a single window, she sat on the edge of her bed and removed her shoes slowly. Her feet were swollen, her back screamed, but she ignored the pain. She opened the drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased at the edges. It showed a man in a worn hat holding a little girl in his arms. Both were smiling with a joy unfiltered by hardship. Her father. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. The last time they spoke, he'd asked her when she was coming home. She had promised it would be soon. Work was busy, she had said. She'd come when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house settled over her like a shroud. She could hear the clinking of glasses in the dining room, the laughter of people who had never wondered if she was tired or lonely or afraid. They didn't need to wonder. To them, she was a shadow, always present, never seen. Sleep came slowly. As she drifted off, her father's voice echoed in her memory. "You're worth more than they'll ever admit. Don't let them make you small." She had once believed him. Once. The next morning began exactly as the last had, before dawn, silence, coffee, ironed tablecloths, a smile she didn't feel, but everything would change soon. Everything. And the Carringtons would finally learn that shadows have voices. The morning began like any other. Maylene stood in the narrow space of her room, adjusting the starch in her collar, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that clung to her bones. The light creeping through the small window was pale, uncertain. She could hear the familiar hum of the estate waking up, the gardener moving about outside, the distant rumble of the chef arriving through the service entrance, the occasional creak of footsteps upstairs. Her days were so mechanical now that time itself seemed to stretch and fold, indistinct and repetitive. There were no surprises in the Carrington house, only expectation, only duty. She had just finished preparing the dining room, setting out the fine silverware and folding the monogrammed napkins into perfect swans, when she heard the gentle vibration of her phone. It was tucked deep in her apron pocket, on silent. She rarely received messages. She was not someone whose phone buzzed with life. But something in the tone of that vibration, a rhythm more urgent, less familiar, made her stop what she was doing. She slipped the phone out with one hand and moved quickly to the butler's pantry, where no one could see her. The message came from her sister, Lorna, the first in weeks. It was short, no punctuation, just 5 words. "Call me now. It's Papa." Her chest tightened. A cold wave rolled through her stomach. She pressed the call button with trembling fingers and raised the phone to her ear. It rang once, then twice. Then Lorna's voice came through, so faint it was almost a breath. "He's gone." Maylene didn't understand at first. The words seemed to hover in the air without anchor into meaning. Then the floor beneath her felt as though it had dropped away. No, what?" "Last night," Lorna whispered. "His heart. He collapsed in the garden. He was gone before I even reached him." A sound escaped from Maylene's throat, low and involuntary. Her knees buckled slightly, and she leaned against the wall to keep from falling. Her fingers pressed into the plaster, searching for something solid. Her father. The man who had held her hand through every childhood storm. The man who taught her how to ride a bicycle by running beside her barefoot through the dust. The man who saved coins in a glass jar for her education, who told her she could be more than the world expected. Gone. Lorna was still talking, her voice choked with tears, but Maylene could no longer process the words. She hung up without knowing she had done it and stood in silence for several moments, the phone slack in her hand. The world had not changed around her. The pantry still smelled faintly of lemon polish and metal. The Carringtons were still upstairs, brushing their teeth, choosing earrings, but everything inside her had shifted, crumbled. When she finally moved, it was with deliberate care, as though any sudden motion would shatter her entirely. She returned to her duties, not out of obligation, but out of reflex. She served coffee to Mrs. Carrington, her hand steady even as her heart screamed. The daughters talked about weekend plans and whether their new shoes had shipped. No one noticed the change in her face, the redness around her eyes, the way her lips pressed tightly together as if to hold something back. By mid-morning, she could no longer pretend. She went to the service stairwell and took the narrow path to the east wing, where Mrs. Carrington spent her mornings. The door to the sitting room was open. Sunlight spilled through gauzy curtains onto a floor so clean it gleamed like ice. Mrs. Carrington sat at her vanity, applying lipstick in short, precise strokes. Her robe was powder blue, her expression serene. Maylene paused at the threshold, then stepped inside and cleared her throat gently. "Ma'am," she said, her voice already unsteady. Mrs. Carrington didn't turn around. "Yes?" I just received a call. My father passed away last night. I'd like to take a few days to attend the funeral." The pause was almost imperceptible, just a flicker in the rhythm of her lipstick. Then she replied, "You know, we have the benefit gala this weekend. The house must be flawless. We can't afford to fall behind." Maylene blinked. "Yes, ma'am, but it's just 4 days. I'll be back before the event." Mrs. Carrington finally turned to look at her, eyes cool and expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't a convenient time. We'll manage without you, but it will be difficult. If you insist, you'll need to forfeit the bonus." The words struck like ice against her chest. "Ma'am, it's my father." "I understand, Maylene, but you must understand this is a professional environment. We all have responsibilities." Before Maylene could respond, Mr. Carrington entered the room, adjusting his cufflinks. He glanced at her with mild surprise. "Something wrong?" "She wants to leave," Mrs. Carrington said. "Her father died." Mr. Carrington looked up, brow furrowed. "That's unfortunate timing. The gala is critical. We can offer a double bonus if she stays. She's needed here." Maylene's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. She could feel her hands clenching at her sides. Her father's face flashed before her. The last photo they took together, him sitting on the porch, smiling through the pain he never admitted. She swallowed hard. "Please," she said, "it's just a few days." "You know how important this weekend is, Maylene," Mr. Carrington said. "Surely your family will understand." She stood there, numb, unsure if she was more shocked by their refusal or by how unsurprised she was. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They were indifferent. That made it worse. Her pain didn't even register as an inconvenience, only a scheduling conflict. "I'll think about it," she murmured, turning quickly before her face betrayed her. She made it to her room before the tears came. They fell silently, hot and fast, soaking into the fabric of her apron. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the photo of her father against her chest. There was a heaviness in her that could not be explained in words. She felt hollowed out, like a bell struck so many times it had cracked. That night, she continued working. She served dinner, cleared the dishes, washed and folded linens. No one asked how she was. No one mentioned her loss. As she moved through the hallways like a ghost, she heard laughter behind closed doors, the clinking of glasses, the familiar hum of wealth at ease with itself. In the dark of her room, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight in her chest would not lift. It pulsed there like something alive, pressing into her ribs, demanding to be named. She had spent so many years in silence, swallowing every injustice. But this was different. This wasn't about a wrinkled tablecloth or a cold cup of coffee. This was her father. This was her last chance to say goodbye. And they had told her it wasn't important. She sat up, pulled the suitcase from beneath her bed, and began to pack. Slowly, methodically. She folded each piece of clothing with care, as if preparing for war. She placed the photograph on top and zipped the suitcase shut. Her movements were steady now, calm, resolute. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the hedges beyond her window. The sky was dark, moonless. She knew what she had to do. She would not be here in the morning. The house was still asleep when Maylene opened her door. It was just past 4 in the morning, that muted hour when the world held its breath and even the clock seemed to tick more gently. Her suitcase sat by the bed, neatly packed the night before. She stood for a moment in the doorway, her hand resting on the edge of the frame, looking back into the small, windowless room that had been hers for 12 years. It was never truly hers, not in the way a room becomes a reflection of one's life. It had never held anything of her except fatigue and quiet grief. There were no decorations, no books, no mementos, just a cot, a chair, and a nightstand where the picture of her father had stood like a secret altar. Now the nightstand was bare. She moved down the servants' corridor, her suitcase wheels whispering against the polished floor. In the grand hallway beyond, the silence was absolute. The chandeliers above were unlit, the tall windows still cloaked in pre-dawn shadow. Maylene walked past them without hesitation. She had polished those windows, scrubbed their sills with toothbrushes. She had dusted the corners of those chandeliers from the top of a ladder while the Carringtons laughed at parties below. All of it felt so far away now, like someone else's memory. In the kitchen, she paused. Her apron hung on its hook. The schedule clipboard was where she had left it. The scent of coffee grounds lingered faintly from the night before. She placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. It contained only a few lines written in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will not be returning. Respectfully, Maylene Jones." She stood there for a second longer, then turned and walked toward the back door. Her fingers had just closed around the handle when a voice stopped her. Leaving without saying goodbye, Mr. Carrington stood in the doorway behind her, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His hair was damp, as if he had just showered, and his tone was calm, almost curious. Maylene straightened her shoulders, but did not turn around. "Yes, that's a shame. I thought we had an understanding." She turned now. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You made it clear yesterday that we do not." He sighed, stepping further into the kitchen. "You're overreacting. I know you're upset, and I'm sorry for your loss, but we had an agreement. You work, we pay you well. That gala was important." She looked him directly in the eyes. "My father's funeral was more important." He frowned, as if genuinely confused by her response. "You should have stayed. Loyalty matters in this world, Maylene. People who show loyalty are rewarded. Others are replaceable." She felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, the warning signal of tears, of anger, of humiliation, but it didn't overtake her this time. Instead, she drew a long, slow breath. "I gave you 12 years, she said. 12 years of my hands, my feet, my silence. I cooked your meals. I raised your children when you were too busy. I ironed your sheets and polished your crystal and took your insults. I missed birthdays, holidays, my niece's graduation. And now you ask me to miss my father's funeral." He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "I'm not asking for anything anymore. I'm leaving. You don't have to understand. You just have to let me go." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a faint smirk, he stepped aside. "Suit yourself. You'll regret this, of course. No one's lining up to hire someone with your background. You had a good deal here. Comfort, security, you'll see." She looked at him, really looked. The man who had once seemed larger than life, with his tailored suits and air of wealth and control, now looked small in the gray morning light. His voice, so often the final word in every decision, now sounded tired. And in that moment, she saw him clearly for what he was, a man who had never once considered her a person. Without another word, she walked past him, opened the door, and stepped out into the still morning air. The street was quiet, the sky a muted slate, the trees standing still as sentinels. She walked briskly to the gate, her suitcase rolling behind her, the sound of its wheels oddly satisfying. The security camera above the gate swiveled toward her, then stopped. She wondered if anyone was watching, if Mrs. Carrington was awake by now, reading her note with pursed lips, wondering how the help could be so ungrateful. She didn't care. The taxi she had called hours ago waited at the curb. The driver stepped out, helped her with the bag without speaking. She slid into the back seat, shut the door, and only then allowed herself to exhale. As the estate disappeared behind her, she felt a strange sensation rising in her chest. Lightness. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It was something quieter. Freedom, maybe. Or simply relief. She leaned her head against the window as the car moved through the city. The streets were just waking, bakeries opening their shutters, newspaper vendors setting up their stalls. In this city, where she had lived in the shadows for over a decade, no one noticed her departure. That, too, felt fitting. At the station, she boarded the early train south, her ticket clutched in one hand, her suitcase in the other. She found a seat by the window and settled in, watching the landscape blur past. Trees, fields, tiny towns. Each mile was a stitch in the thread pulling her back to where she had come from, back to the place she had left so long ago believing it had nothing for her. She arrived in her hometown just as the sun crested over the hills. The station was small, only one platform surrounded by dusty roads and overgrown grass. She stepped off the train and stood for a moment, breathing in the air. It smelled of earth and morning dew. It smelled like memory. Her sister was there, waiting. Lorna was thinner than she remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired. But when she saw Maylene, her face broke into something between a sob and a smile. They embraced without words, holding each other tightly, the years and distance crumbling like ash between them. They walked home together, arm in arm, the silence between them full of meaning. Along the way, neighbors peeked from windows, recognizing her. An old man on his porch lifted a hand in greeting. A little boy on a bicycle waved. She was no longer invisible here. At the house, smaller than she remembered, but still standing strong, she was met with the scent of fried plantains and sage. The front porch creaked under her feet, the paint peeling in familiar patterns. Inside, the rooms were filled with flowers, visitors, and quiet weeping. Her father's chair was empty, but the memory of him lingered everywhere. In the photographs on the wall, the worn boots by the door, the hand-carved walking stick leaning against the table. She moved through the house like someone stepping into an old skin, rediscovering who she had once been. Later that evening, as the house quieted, she sat alone in her father's room. The suitcase sat unopened in the corner. In her lap was the same photograph she had carried with her for years, her father holding her at the edge of their small garden, both of them beaming. "I'm home," she whispered. The funeral would be in 2 days. There would be stories and songs, prayers and laughter. But for now, in this quiet room, she allowed herself to grieve, to feel the full weight of loss, and for the first time in years she cried without hiding. The rain came before the sun, thin at first, then heavier, draping the town in a wet hush that felt somehow appropriate, as though the sky itself was mourning alongside them. Maylene stood by the window of her childhood bedroom, watching droplets race down the pane, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. The house around her stirred gently, murmured voices from the kitchen, footsteps on the stairs, the occasional sound of someone clearing their throat to hold back emotion. The scent of boiled cassava and strong coffee drifted from below, mingling with the heavy dampness of the air. Everything in the house was both smaller and more sacred than she remembered. The faded sofa in the living room with the blanket her mother had knitted before she passed. The crooked photograph on the wall of her parents in younger days, both laughing with their heads thrown back. The floorboards still creaked in the same places, and the screen door at the back still hung slightly off its hinge. Time had touched the house gently, and now death had reached in and curled its fingers around it, changing everything. She had not unpacked her suitcase. It stood near the foot of the bed like a reminder of the life she had left behind, neatly packed, practical, silent. Her city shoes, polished and stiff, were now damp and streaked with dust from the train station and the walk through town. Her funeral dress, pressed the night before, hung from the back of the door. It was a simple black garment, modest and soft, and yet, when she slipped into it, she felt its weight settle over her like a shroud. Her sister, Lorna, entered without knocking, holding a steaming mug in her hands. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed red, her expression soft. "Have some," she said simply, offering the cup. Maylene took it, murmured her thanks, and sat on the edge of the bed. "He loved the rain," Lorna said, looking out the window. "Said it made the world honest." Maylene nodded. She could almost hear his voice saying those very words, rough and amused, as he stood on the porch with his hat askew, letting the rain fall over him. He had always been that way, unbothered by discomfort, able to find poetry in inconvenience. She missed him so fiercely it hurt to breathe. The church was at the edge of town, a modest white building with a steeple that leaned ever so slightly to the left. Its paint had begun to peel in long, curling strips from years of humidity and storms. But the doors still opened wide, and the pews still held the weight of mourning. By the time they arrived, the lot was already filled with neighbors, family members, friends who had known her father as a mentor, a mechanic, a storyteller, man of dignity and work. They came in suits that didn't quite fit and dresses that had been carefully mended. They brought umbrellas and casseroles, comfort and song. They brought memories. Inside the church, the air smelled of damp wood, candle wax, and flowers, so many flowers, spilling from vases and boxes, white lilies and chrysanthemums and sprays of deep red roses. At the front stood the coffin, simple and polished, adorned with a folded flag and a photograph of her father grinning beside a broken-down tractor he had once rebuilt by hand. Maylene walked slowly to the front with her sister, their hands intertwined. She looked at the photograph and felt the breath catch in her throat. The eyes were exactly as she remembered, kind, stubborn, full of wit. She could almost imagine him there beside her, whispering one of his dry remarks, nudging her arm to keep her from crying. But he was gone. The service began with an old hymn, sung in harmonies that quivered and rose like smoke. The pastor, a tall man with a gentle voice, spoke of her father's life, his devotion to his daughters, his belief that hard work was holy and kindness was its own kind of wealth. Lorna read a poem. An old neighbor told a story about the time her father had fixed an entire community's power line with nothing but a ladder, a hammer, and faith. The congregation laughed through their tears. When it was Maylene's turn to speak, she felt her legs tremble beneath her. She rose slowly and walked to the pulpit, clutching a folded piece of paper in her hands, though she already knew the words by heart. She looked out at the faces, weathered, patient, open. These were people who remembered her as a child, who had watched her leave for the city in search of a better life. Now they watched her return, her grief palpable, her story largely unknown. "My father was not a rich man," she began, her voice soft but sure. "He never traveled far, never sought status or fame. But he had a kind of wealth most people never touch. He gave with his hands. He gave with his time. He believed in showing up, even when it was hard, especially then." She paused, breathing deeply. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I was too far away, caught in a life that rewarded silence and obedience, a life where I became small so others could feel large. And I let it happen for too long. I let it happen until I forgot what my father taught me, that my worth is not measured by how well I serve others' comfort, but by how I honor my own truth." She looked down at the casket, her vision blurring. "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. But I'm here now, and I promise I won't let your voice disappear." The silence that followed her words was heavy and reverent. She stepped down and returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Her sister reached over and took her hand again, squeezing it once, hard. The service continued with more songs, a final prayer, and the slow, solemn procession to the cemetery behind the church. The rain had become a steady downpour, drenching the grass, turning the ground into dark, rich mud. Umbrellas bloomed like flowers in the crowd as they gathered around the open grave. Maylene stood beside her sister, the photograph of her father clutched to her chest. She had taken it from her room that morning, unable to part with it. In it, he stood tall in the garden, his hands on his hips, a sun hat pushed back on his head, his smile wide and unbothered by the heat or the flies. It had been taken during her last visit home, before the years pulled her further away. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the sound of ropes and pulleys barely audible over the rain, she felt her knees weaken. A sob escaped her lips, raw and unguarded. She did not try to stop it. Her grief had its place here, among the people who loved him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing the frame to her chest. "I should have been here. I should have held your hand." Arms encircled her then, Lorna's, a cousin's, an aunt's. They surrounded her in silence, their warmth steady, their presence an anchor. It did not erase the guilt, but it dulled its edges. "He knew," Lorna murmured into her hair. "He always knew you loved him." The rain did not let up. It soaked through clothes, plastered hair to faces, dripped into shoes. No one moved. When the final clump of earth hit the coffin with a dull thud, Maylene closed her eyes. The sound was both ending and beginning. Later, after the service, the house filled with people again. They brought food and stories, hugs and laughter, trying to create light where there had been darkness. The living room hummed with conversation. Children darted between legs, and old friends clinked glasses in remembrance. It was the kind of gathering her father would have loved, unfussy, warm, honest. Maylene sat on the porch, her legs curled beneath her, watching the rain continue to fall beyond the overhang. Her dress was damp, her feet muddy, but for the first time in years she felt grounded, present. She listened to the voices behind her, the laughter and the quiet cries, and felt herself slowly coming back to life. Inside, her nephew Noah, Lorna's oldest son, approached with a notebook tucked under his arm. He was 23, bright-eyed, thoughtful, a local journalist who had been covering community stories since high school. He sat beside her without a word, offering her a paper towel to dry her hands. "You said something at the church," he said softly, "about being made small." She nodded, unsure where he was going. "I've been writing a column, just small pieces, people's stories, honest ones." He hesitated. "Would you want to share yours?" Maylene stared at him, her heart thudding. "My story?" "Not with names," he said quickly, "not even yours if you don't want. But what happened to you? It matters. People need to hear it." She looked down at her hands, the calluses etched into her palms like a map of everything she'd endured. The thought of speaking out, even anonymously, terrified her. But it also stirred something in her chest, something long buried and aching to be known. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't say no. That night, After the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet again, she sat at her father's old desk, a pen in hand. The photograph still lay beside her, and she touched it now and then as she began to write. She didn't write everything, but she wrote enough. She wrote about the silence, the coldness, the years of being unseen, the moment she chose to leave, and most importantly, the promise she made to herself at his grave, that she would never again let anyone decide her worth. It was the first time she had told the truth out loud, and she wasn't done yet. The house was still when Maylene awoke. It had been 2 days since the funeral, but the scent of rain still lingered in the floorboards, and the sorrow hung thick in the walls as if the house itself were reluctant to move on. She lay beneath a familiar quilt, listening to the gentle creak of the wind against the roof, and for a few precious minutes she did not move. It was the first morning in years that she had not been summoned by a schedule, a bell, or the unspoken expectation of servitude. There were no linens to press, no chandeliers to polish, no shallow orders to obey. Only stillness. She rose slowly, padding barefoot into the hallway. The house, though humble, was full of life now. Cousins visiting from other towns, neighbors dropping off casseroles and pies, and voices that rose and fell in a comforting rhythm. Her niece was coloring at the kitchen table. Lorna was on the phone, her voice low and measured. Someone had brought a basket of fresh plantains and left it on the counter. For the first time in years, Maylene felt the pulse of belonging, of being among people who saw her not as an extension of their convenience, but as part of something sacred. She made coffee, just as her father used to, boiling water in the kettle, scooping the ground beans with the same dented spoon he had always used. She stood by the stove, watching the dark liquid swirl in the pot, and tried not to think of the Carringtons, their polished kitchen, their bone china cups and calculated detachment. She focused instead on the small sounds of the house, the scrape of a chair, the laugh of a child, the rustle of morning papers. Noah arrived shortly after breakfast. He carried his notebook under his arm and wore the kind of guarded expression that meant he had been thinking too much. He greeted her with a quiet hug, then gestured toward the porch. "Walk?" he asked. She nodded, and they stepped out into the soft morning sun. The rain had passed, leaving behind a world that shimmered with newness, puddles glinting in the road, leaves beating with moisture, the air thick with the scent of wet soil and citrus. They walked in silence at first, following the winding path that led to the edge of the town, where the fields began and the sky opened wide. Eventually, Noah stopped by an old wooden bench under a sprawling mango tree and sat. He opened his notebook and began flipping through its pages, each filled with tidy handwriting and underlined quotes. Then he looked up at her. "I worked on your story," he said. "I cleaned it up a little, just the grammar, some structure, but I didn't change your voice. I wouldn't do that." She sat beside him, heart thudding. "And I submitted it last night." She turned toward him sharply. "Not with names," he assured her. "It's titled The Maid's Letter. No dates, no cities, just the story. Honest, as you asked." She stared at him, stunned. 100 emotions rose at once. Fear, pride, uncertainty, hope. "Why didn't you wait?" she asked softly. "Because it needed to be told," he said. "And I think the world needed to hear it." They said nothing more. The wind moved through the branches above them, sending a soft rain of petals and dust to the ground. Maylene closed her eyes and listened to the rustle, the hum of insects, the distant call of birds. Her heart trembled. They returned home in silence, but the silence was different now. Not absence, but anticipation. That night, the calls began. The first was from a local editor who had picked up Noah's piece. Then came a request from a regional radio show for an anonymous reading. The article had spread faster than either of them expected, circulating through social media, finding its way into inboxes and message boards and private group chats. Some readers responded with tears, others with fury, many with recognition. Maylene stayed up late reading the messages Noah forwarded to her. There were dozens, then hundreds. Women who had worked in households just like hers, who had raised children that were not theirs, who had folded towels with trembling hands while biting their tongues through humiliation. "I thought it was just me," one message read. "I never told anyone what they did to me," said another. And then, "Thank you for giving us a voice." She wept that night, curled up on her childhood bed, the old photo of her father in her hand. Her tears were not only for him, but for herself, for the girl she had been, for the years she had spent erasing herself to make others more comfortable, for the woman who had finally said no. Within days, the article reached a national blog that focused on labor rights and domestic workers' issues. They requested an interview. She refused. Not yet. But she allowed them to reprint the article, word for word, without edits. Soon after, a prominent news outlet picked up the piece. Then, a celebrity with millions of followers shared it with a caption that read, "This is what systemic silence looks like." From there, it spread like wildfire. Maylene did not leave the house for 3 days. She stayed mostly in the back room reading the emails Noah printed out for her, listening as her sister answered calls and explained that Maylene was not accepting interviews. Not yet. That she needed space. That she was still grieving. But it wasn't just grief now. It was something deeper, something transformative, like a river carving a canyon, slow and unstoppable. One afternoon, Lorna came into her room with a newspaper in hand. "They're saying it's about the Carringtons," she said, voice low. Maylene froze. "How?" "Someone recognized the details, a former staff member, and now people are talking." The newspaper ran an investigative piece, piecing together anonymous sources, financial records, and internal complaints. It painted a damning portrait of the Carrington family's treatment of domestic workers. The story included testimonies, unverified but powerful, of verbal abuse, withheld wages, and racial condescension. Suddenly, the Carringtons were under a microscope. Television news anchors debated the ethics of wealth and labor. Talk shows hosted panels on domestic work and dignity. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting the anonymous author of the Maid's letter. And through it all, Maylene remained silent. Not out of fear. Out of power. She watched from afar as the people who had once dismissed her pain scrambled to protect their reputations. A photo surfaced of Mrs. Carrington stepping into a luxury SUV, face obscured by oversized sunglasses, mouth tight. Reporters hounded their estate. Drones circled the manicured lawns, and headlines speculated about canceled contracts and withdrawn invitations to charity galas. Maylene did not gloat, but neither did she grieve for them. One evening, she sat with Lorna on the porch, watching the fireflies bloom in the dusky air. Her niece had fallen asleep on a blanket nearby, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "I think I'm ready," Maylene said quietly. Lorna turned to her, eyes warm. "Ready for what?" "To stop hiding." The next morning, she recorded a statement. She did not name names. She did not lash out. She told her story again, in her own voice, for a podcast dedicated to labor justice. She spoke of what it meant to be invisible. Of the day, she was told that her father's death was less important than polished silverware. Of how she walked away from a life that had cost her soul. When the podcast aired, it went viral within hours. People wept. People stood up. People remembered. And Maylene, who had once scrubbed marble floors in silence, became a symbol, not of revenge, but of awakening. She did not seek fame. She did not seek pity. She only wanted truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be unheard. The Carrington name faded into shame. Their gala was canceled. Their friends distanced themselves. No amount of wealth could cleanse what had been revealed. But Maylene, she had found something far more precious than any of that. She had found her voice, and the world had listened. The morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtain of Maylene's room, soft and golden, brushing against her cheek like a warm hand. She opened her eyes slowly, unhurriedly, with none of the panic that used to accompany her waking hours. There was no alarm, no silent dread about a forgotten task, no list of demands echoing in her mind before her feet touched the floor, just light, warmth, and stillness. The kind that only comes with peace hard-earned. It had been nearly a month since her story had swept across the country, igniting conversations, protests, and apologies she never asked for. She had since withdrawn from the storm, retreated not into fear, but into something quieter and truer. The Carringtons were no longer her concern. Their faces had disappeared from the news, replaced by newer scandals, louder stories. But the effects lingered. Whispers of lawsuits, lost endorsements, rumors of a move abroad. None of it mattered to her anymore. Her silence had shattered. Her voice had done its work. Now she needed to build. It was Lorna who first brought her the flyer. She placed it on the kitchen table beside a warm plate of cassava and eggs one morning, her expression cautious but hopeful. "They're looking for help at the shelter," she said gently. "Not cleaning, not like before. A coordinator. Someone who understands what these women are going through." Maylene glanced at the flyer. The text was plain, straightforward. Community shelter for women and children. Seeking full-time staff for intake and support coordination. Experience preferred. Empathy required. She didn't say yes that day. She didn't say no either. Instead, she carried the flyer with her as she walked through the town, past the market where she used to buy sugar cane as a child, past the school where her father had fixed the roof for free, past the little house with the green shutters where her cousin Miriam had once taught her how to braid. Every corner of the town whispered memories, each more tender than the last. That night, she sat by the window with a notebook in her lap. She stared at the blank page for a long time, then wrote one sentence. "I want to do something that matters." The next morning, she applied. The shelter sat in a modest brick building at the edge of town, tucked behind a clinic and a row of tall trees. It was quiet when she arrived, the air filled with the smell of soap and wildflowers. A young woman greeted her at the door, wide-eyed and eager, and led her through a series of narrow halls painted in calming shades of blue and green. There were toys in the corner of the main room, a rack of donated clothes neatly organized, a bulletin board covered in affirmations and local resources. The director, a stern but kind woman named Angela, interviewed her over tea. She had read the article. She had listened to the podcast, but she didn't mention any of it until the very end. "I don't want a symbol," she said. "I want someone who shows up every day and remembers what it's like to be invisible. Can you do that?" "Yes," Maylene said. "I can." She started work the following week. The hours were long, but not heavy. She wasn't scrubbing floors or carrying trays. She was meeting with women, some with bruises hidden beneath scarves, others with children clinging to their legs, some too tired to speak at all. Her job was to listen, to record their stories, to connect them to resources, to help them believe that a different life was possible. In those early days, she mostly sat with them in silence, offering what she could: a cup of tea, a nod, a hand to hold. At first, the women didn't trust her. They saw her uniform, the badge clipped to her shirt, and assumed she was another gatekeeper. But gradually, as they watched the way she moved, the way she folded clothes without complaint, the way she leaned in when they spoke, they began to soften. One woman, Clara, had arrived with 2 sons and nothing else. Her husband had locked her out one night with no shoes and a swollen cheek. She didn't speak for 3 days. Maylene brought her warm towels and left food at her door without a word. On the 4th day, Clara said thank you. On the 5th, she asked Maylene to sit with her while she filled out her housing forms. Another woman, young and wide-eyed, asked Maylene how she stayed calm. "You look like you've seen worse," she said. "I have," Maylene replied, her voice gentle, "but I also know it gets better." Each day at the shelter became a stitch in a new life, a patch and a quilt she was slowly learning how to make for herself. She no longer measured her worth by the whiteness of a tablecloth or the shine of a floor. Her value lived in the way people relaxed their shoulders when they saw her, the way children reached for her hand, the way tears stopped falling when she simply sat near. On weekends, she took long walks alone. She wrote in her journal. She visited her father's grave and told him stories about the women she worked with, about the children who played tag in the halls of the shelter, about how much she was learning, even now, even after everything. She planted herbs in the backyard and cooked for her sister's family on Sundays. Life, in its simplest form, had returned. One afternoon, a woman from a local university reached out. She was organizing a panel on labor rights and resilience. She had read Maylene's story and wanted her to speak. Maylene hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to step back into that spotlight, but Angela encouraged her. "Your voice helped start something," she said, "but voices echo. You don't have to shout to be heard." So, Maylene agreed. She stood on a small stage in front of a modest audience, most of them students, activists, and community leaders. She didn't prepare a speech. She spoke from memory, from experience, from the place in her that had been broken and rebuilt again. "I used to believe my silence kept me safe," she told them. "That if I stayed quiet, followed the rules, did my job perfectly, I'd be respected. I was wrong. Silence only protected the people who benefited from it. It did nothing for me." She paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. "I walked away from a life that made me small, and now I help others do the same. I'm not anyone's maid anymore. I'm a woman who listens, who remembers, who understands." When she stepped off the stage, people stood, not with thunderous applause, but with quiet reverence, the kind that honors truth when it's spoken plainly. Afterward, a young woman approached her in tears. "I work for a family like that," she whispered. "I thought I had no choice." Maylene took her hand. "You always have a choice," she said. By the end of the evening, 3 more women had asked her for advice. One asked for a hug. One simply said, "Thank you." Back at the shelter, the children greeted her with drawings and questions. The women smiled when she entered the room. She was no longer Maylene the maid. She was Miss Maylene, the one who helped find an apartment, who knew which clinic was kind, who always remembered their names. She found herself smiling more often, laughing, sleeping through the night. Her past still lived within her, but it no longer defined her. It had become the soil from which she had grown. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, she sat on the porch of the shelter, her notebook in her lap. The pages were full now, not with sorrow, but with stories. Stories of women who fought their way back to themselves. Stories of survival, of quiet power, of dignity reclaimed. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "I used to be invisible. Now I am seen. I used to whisper. Now I speak. I used to serve without question. Now I choose whom I serve and why." She closed the notebook, smiling. She had found her place, not in servitude, but in strength. The letter arrived in a cream-colored envelope, its edges pressed with a delicate gold border. It was addressed to Miss Maylene Jones, written in elegant cursive that looked almost too formal for the small mailbox outside the women's shelter. Angela handed it to her on a Tuesday morning, frowning slightly as she turned it over in her hands. "Looks fancy," she remarked before returning to the front desk. Maylene opened it slowly, carefully, as though it might shatter if she handled it too quickly. Inside was an invitation. An embossed card bearing the seal of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. It invited her to speak at their annual conference in the Capitol, where advocates, policymakers, and women from across the country would gather. There, they wanted her to share her story, her real story in full, under her own name. She stared at the words for a long time. In the months since she had begun working at the shelter, her life had taken on a quiet rhythm, gentle and full. She had begun to trust her own reflection again, to hear her own thoughts without flinching. But the idea of stepping back into the public light, not as a shadow or a symbol, but as a woman who had lived through the fire and come out the other side, both excited and terrified her. She did not answer right away. The card sat on her nightstand for days, untouched, waiting. But it lingered in her mind through each intake interview, each late-night cup of tea with a frightened mother, each whispered thank you from a woman who had finally found her footing. Eventually, she knew. Her silence had broken once, and it had rippled further than she could have imagined. This time, she would choose to break it again, on her terms. She sent back her acceptance with a handwritten note and returned to her work without mentioning it to anyone at first. There was a stillness to her confidence now, rooted in something deeper than before. She no longer questioned the worth of her words. When the day arrived, she traveled alone. She boarded the early train, suitcase in hand, dressed in a soft gray dress that her sister had pressed for her the night before. The platform was quiet, the sun barely risen, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. As the train rumbled forward, she watched the fields give way to cities, the small towns blurring into wide highways, the familiar fading behind her like the closing pages of a chapter. The Capitol was loud, crowded, full of glass buildings and people who walked with purpose. She moved through it with a kind of calm reverence, taking in the noise without being swallowed by it. She was not here as someone's employee, someone's maid. She was here because they had asked her, because she had something worth hearing. The conference center loomed ahead, tall and gleaming, banners flapping from its balconies, each bearing a word in bold white letters: dignity, voice, justice. Inside, the air buzzed with conversation and footsteps, the kind of energy that hummed with movement, with action. She was escorted backstage by a young assistant with nervous eyes and a clipboard. "We're so honored to have you," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. Maylene smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I'm honored to be here." She waited behind the curtain, listening to the voice of the speaker before her. He spoke about wage theft, about the unpaid labor of women across the world, about invisible work that built empires and left nothing for those who performed it. The audience clapped. Then the announcer stepped up to the podium and said her name. When Maylene walked onto the stage, the room fell into a hush, not out of disinterest, but in respect. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, waiting. She adjusted the microphone with steady hands. "I was a maid for 12 years, she began, her voice firm, unhurried, in a house where my name was rarely used, where my grief was inconvenient, where I learned how to disappear without leaving." She paused, let the words settle. Then she continued, "I stayed because I was afraid, because I thought silence was safer than truth, because I believed, for a long time, that I didn't matter enough to speak." A murmur rippled through the room, recognition, sympathy, anger. But silence doesn't protect us. It cages us. And when I lost my father and they told me to keep working, when they told me his funeral didn't fit their schedule, I realized the truth. She looked out at the crowd, locking eyes with a woman in the front row whose chin was trembling. I was never invisible. They just refused to see me. She spoke for 20 minutes. She told them about the long nights, the humiliations, the way her spirit had withered under polished silver and marble floors. She told them about leaving, about the funeral in the rain, about the letter her nephew helped her write, about the firestorm that followed, about the shelter, the women, the children, the laughter, the healing. When she finished, the room rose in silence. There was no immediate applause, just the sound of people standing, moved by something deeper than rhetoric. Then came the clapping, loud, sustained, a rising tide of appreciation and awe. After the session, people lined up to thank her. Some hugged her with tears in their eyes. Some just touched her arm and whispered, "Me too." She returned home quietly, without fanfare. The train ride back was peaceful, the sun setting in golden streaks across the windows. Lorna met her at the station with a smile and a thermos of warm ginger tea. No words were needed. Her eyes said everything. Back at the shelter, things resumed as before. She filed papers. She made tea. She held hands and passed out brochures. But something had shifted. The women looked at her differently now, not with awe, but with recognition. She was no longer just a coordinator. She was proof that it was possible to survive, to leave, to speak. Weeks later, she returned to the graveyard at the edge of town. The grass had grown tall, and the path was dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. She stood before her father's grave, the wind teasing at her skirt, and knelt to brush away the fallen leaves. "I did it, Papa," she said. "I kept my promise." She sat beside the headstone for a while, letting the breeze carry her voice as she spoke softly, recounting everything that had happened since her last visit. The letter, the speech, the quiet ripple of change. She told him about the women who still came to the shelter trembling and left with their heads high. She told him about the children who ran through the halls with laughter in their lungs. She told him about her voice, how it had once been a whisper and now carried further than she had ever dreamed. As the sun dipped lower, she rose, brushing off her skirt, and smiled. She no longer lived in silence, and the silence, once so vast and heavy, no longer ruled. It waited, and when she spoke again, it listened. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to discover another powerful journey, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.